The sirens began at 2100 hours on the night of December 29th, 1940. In the operations room beneath Bentley Priory, RAF Fighter Command Headquarters, officers watched as plotting tables filled with markers representing incoming German aircraft. The raid was massive. Over 130 bombers approaching London from the east. This was not unusual. For 4 months, German bombers had come nearly every night. What made this night different was what happened next, and what would eventually happen in return. At 21:15, the first incendiary bombs fell on the city of London. Within 30 minutes, 1,500 fires were burning across the square mile of the ancient financial district. The Thames was at low tide, leaving fire brigades unable to draw sufficient water. High explosive bombs had fractured water mains. Flames spread from building to building in the tight medieval streets. By midnight, the entire city was an inferno visible from 50 miles away. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. German bomber crews flying at 15,000 feet could navigate by the glow alone. They called it the Second Great Fire of London. British firefighters, many of them volunteers with minimal training, fought the flames until dawn. 8 churches designed by Christopher Wren were destroyed. The Guildhall, dating to 1411, was gutted. Thousands of buildings burned. Remarkably, only 16 civilians died that night, most people having evacuated the city after business hours. But the material destruction was immense, and the Germans knew it. Reconnaissance photographs taken the next morning showed entire city blocks reduced to rubble and ash. German newspapers proclaimed a great victory. Luftwaffe commanders congratulated their crews. This was strategic bombing as they understood it, destroying the enemy's economic infrastructure, breaking civilian morale, forcing capitulation without the need for ground invasion. They believed they were winning. They believed Britain would soon have to negotiate. They believed their doctrine of strategic air power was being vindicated by these raids, night after night, week after week, month after month. They had no way of knowing that they had started something they could not finish, that they had demonstrated a form of warfare they could not sustain, and that the answer to their 8 months of bombing would be 5 years of bombing in return, on a scale they could never have imagined. The irony was profound, and would only become clear with time. Germany had pioneered strategic bombing in this war. Germany would also become history's most thoroughly bombed nation, experiencing destruction that made the London Blitz look modest by comparison. The architects of aerial terror would discover what it meant to live under bombs, not for months, but for years, without respite, without hope of making it stop. The theory behind strategic bombing had been developing for 2 decades before the first German bomber appeared over London. Military theorists, particularly the Italian General Giulio Douhet, had argued since the 1920s that future wars would be won by air power. Douhet's book, The Command of the Air, published in 1921, proposed that bombers could bypass ground armies entirely and strike directly at an enemy's industrial base and civilian population. The psychological effect, Douhet claimed, would be decisive. Civilians, unlike soldiers, were not trained to endure combat. Mass bombing would create panic, breakdown of social order, and pressure on governments to surrender. The theory was elegant and appealing to Air Force advocates across Europe. It suggested that the grinding attrition of World War I, the years of trench warfare and millions of casualties, could be avoided. A nation with sufficient bomber forces could win quickly and decisively by destroying the enemy's ability and will to fight. Germany, particularly after the Nazis came to power in 1933, embraced this doctrine with modifications. The Luftwaffe was created as an independent air force in 1935, officially violating the Treaty of Versailles. Hermann Göring, a World War I fighter ace and one of Hitler's closest associates, became commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe. Under his leadership, Germany invested heavily in bomber development. The Heinkel He-111 entered service in 1935. The Dornier Do-17 followed in 1937. The Junkers Ju-88, which would become Germany's most versatile bomber, began production in 1939. These were modern aircraft for their time, fast enough to evade many fighters, heavily armed with defensive machine guns, and capable of carrying substantial bomb loads. The Luftwaffe tested its theories in combat before World War II officially began. During the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939, German bomber units supported Franco's nationalist forces. The bombing of Guernica on April 26, 1937, became internationally infamous. German aircraft attacked the Basque town on Market Day, dropping high explosive and incendiary bombs, then strafing fleeing civilians with machine gun fire. Estimates of casualties ranged from several hundred to over 1,000 dead. The raid achieved its military objective of destroying a strategic crossroads, but it also demonstrated the terror effect of aerial bombardment on civilian populations. Pablo Picasso's painting Guernica, completed that same year, captured the horror and became an enduring symbol of bombing's impact on non-combatants. German officers studied the results carefully. The psychological impact seemed to confirm Duhay's theories. Civilian populations, they concluded, could not withstand sustained aerial attack. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, the Luftwaffe employed strategic bombing alongside tactical support for ground forces. Warsaw was bombed heavily in September 1939. Over 25,000 civilians died in the siege. The city surrendered on September 27th. German propaganda emphasized that bombing had broken Polish resistance. This reinforced the Luftwaffe's confidence in strategic air power as a decisive weapon. The campaign against Britain began differently than Poland or Spain. Initially, German bombers focused on military targets, RAF airfields, aircraft factories, ports, and shipping. This was the Battle of Britain, from July to October 1940, primarily an air superiority campaign. The Luftwaffe attempted to destroy the RAF as a precondition for invasion. German planners believed that without air cover, the Royal Navy would be vulnerable to air attack, and Operation Sea Lion, the planned amphibious invasion of Britain, could proceed. The Luftwaffe had advantages in numbers and experience. Germany could deploy approximately 2,600 bombers and fighters for operations against Britain. These aircraft were crewed by men who had combat experience from Spain, Poland, Norway, France, and the Low Countries. They were confident, well-trained, and equipped with modern machines. By contrast, RAF Fighter Command, under Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, had fewer than 700 operational fighters in July 1940. But the British had critical advantages the Germans did not fully appreciate. They had radar, a technology that allowed them to detect incoming raids and direct fighters to intercept. They had the home chain, a network of radar stations along the coast that provided early warning. They had the sector system, a command and control network that coordinated fighter squadrons efficiently. And they were fighting over their own territory, where downed pilots could return to duty if they survived, while German pilots who bailed out became prisoners. The battle was fierce through August and September 1940. The Luftwaffe attacked RAF airfields, attempting to destroy fighters on the ground and crater runways. RAF Fighter Command suffered heavy losses in aircraft and experienced pilots. By early September, the system was under severe strain. Several sector airfields had been badly damaged. Pilot fatigue was becoming critical. If the Luftwaffe had maintained pressure on the RAF's infrastructure, the outcome might have been different. But on September 7, 1940, the Luftwaffe changed tactics. Instead of attacking RAF bases, the bombers turned toward London. The reasons for this shift have been debated by historians. Part of the motivation was retaliation. On August 25th, RAF Bomber Command had sent 81 aircraft to bomb Berlin in response to German bombs falling on London, likely accidentally. The raid caused minimal damage but infuriated Hitler, who had promised the German people that no enemy bomber would reach the Reich capital. Hitler ordered attacks on British cities. Goering, believing the RAF was nearly defeated, saw an opportunity to deliver a knockout blow against British morale. The Luftwaffe would bomb London until Britain surrendered. On the afternoon of September the 7th, 348 German bombers, escorted by 617 fighters, attacked London's docks and East End. The raid lasted hours. Fires consumed entire neighborhoods. Over 400 civilians died that day. The bombers returned that night and dropped more incendiaries. This was the beginning of the Blitz. For 57 consecutive nights, German bombers attacked London. Then they expanded the campaign to other cities: Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester, Glasgow, Belfast, Bristol, Southampton, Plymouth. The attacks continued through May 1941, 8 months of sustained strategic bombing. German crews flew these missions with confidence born from their earlier victories. They believed they were demonstrating the future of warfare, that they were breaking Britain's will to fight, that surrender was only a matter of time. They were wrong, but they would not understand how wrong until much later, when British and American bombers came to Germany. The Luftwaffe's bombing campaign against Britain, viewed from German airfields and operations rooms, appeared successful through the winter of 1940 and into 1941. Bomber crews returned with reports of massive fires, destroyed docks, shattered factories. Reconnaissance photographs showed damage across British cities. Intelligence officers compiled statistics that seemed impressive. Thousands of buildings destroyed, hundreds of thousands of people made homeless, industrial production disrupted. The numbers told a story German commanders wanted to hear. During the 8 months of the Blitz, from September 1940 through May 1941, the Luftwaffe dropped approximately 41,000 tons of high explosive bombs and incendiaries on British cities. London received roughly 2/3 of this tonnage, roughly 28,000 tons. The attacks killed approximately 43,000 British civilians and seriously injured another 139,000. 2 million homes were damaged or destroyed. Though many of these were repairable, these were significant numbers, representing real suffering and real destruction, but they were not sufficient to break British war production or civilian morale. British aircraft factories, dispersed and protected, continued operating. In 1941, Britain produced over 20,000 aircraft, more than Germany produced that same year. Shipyards continued building vessels. Munitions plants maintained output. The British government, far from collapsing, grew more determined. Churchill's defiant speeches resonated with a population that refused to be terrorized into surrender. The Luftwaffe's capability to sustain the bombing offensive was limited by factors German planners had not fully considered. The bombers available to Germany in 1940 had been designed primarily for tactical support of ground forces, not strategic campaigns requiring long range and heavy bomb loads. The Heinkel He 111 could carry approximately 4,400 pounds of bombs at maximum load, but only for short ranges. For missions to Britain and back, the practical bomb load was closer to 3,000 pounds. The Dornier Du 17, nicknamed the Flying Pencil for its slender fuselage, carried even less, typically around 2,200 pounds. The Junkers Ju 88 was more capable, carrying up to 6,600 pounds for short missions, but again, range limitations reduced this for attacks on Britain. Compare these figures to what would come later. The British Lancaster bomber, entering service in 1942, could carry 14,000 pounds for medium-range missions and up to 22,000 pounds of bombs for shorter ranges. Navigation presented another challenge. German bombers relied primarily on dead reckoning and radio beam systems like Nicobene and X-Juret to find targets at night. These systems were effective initially, but became less reliable as the British developed electronic countermeasures. Bombers frequently missed their intended targets by miles, dropping bombs on open countryside or wrong cities entirely. The accuracy rate for hitting specific industrial targets was poor, perhaps 20% at best. RAF night fighters, initially ineffective, gradually improved. The Bristol Beaufighter, equipped with airborne radar, entered service in late 1940. These aircraft began inflicting increasing losses on German bomber streams. By spring 1941, Luftwaffe bomber losses were rising to unsustainable levels. Aircraft production could not keep pace with losses. Crew training schools could not produce qualified replacements fast enough. The campaign was exhausting German bomber strength without achieving strategic victory. Then came the critical decision that ended the Blitz. In May 1941, Hitler ordered the transfer of bomber units east in preparation for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The Luftwaffe needed its bombers to support ground operations in Russia. The strategic bombing of Britain effectively ended, not because it had succeeded, but because Germany needed those aircraft elsewhere. The last major raid on London occurred on May 10, 1941. After that, only sporadic attacks continued. While Germany turned its attention eastward, Britain was building a strategic bombing force specifically designed for long-range attacks on German cities and Industry RAF Bomber Command, under Air Marshal Arthur Harris, beginning in February 1942, received new heavy bombers and expanded dramatically. The government made a strategic decision. Germany would experience bombing on a scale that made the Blitz look modest. The Lancaster bomber represented a qualitative leap beyond anything available in 1940. It was a 4-engine heavy bomber with a range of approximately 2,500 miles. It could reach any target in Germany from bases in England. Its bomb bay was enormous, designed to accommodate bombs of unprecedented size. The standard operational load was 14,000 pounds, but the Lancaster could carry special weapons, including the 8,000-pound blockbuster bomb and eventually the 22,000-pound Grand Slam, the largest conventional bomb used in the war. Britain produced over 7,300 Lancasters during the war. They were joined by over 7,700 Halifax bombers, another heavy 4-engine aircraft, and smaller numbers of Stirlings and other types. This was industrial production on a scale Germany could not match. Britain, despite being bombed, despite fighting in North Africa and later in Italy, despite maintaining naval forces across multiple oceans, built a strategic bomber force larger and more capable than the Luftwaffe had ever possessed. The Americans brought even greater resources. The United States Army Air Forces deployed 2 types of 4-engine heavy bombers to Europe. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress entered production in 1941. Over 12,700 were eventually built. The consolidated B-24 Liberator, produced in even larger numbers, exceeded 18,000 units. These aircraft were designed from the start for strategic bombing with heavy defensive armament, long range, and substantial bomb loads. American doctrine differed from British practice. The RAF, having suffered heavy losses in daylight raids early in the war, had shifted to night bombing. Aircraft attacked individually or in streams, finding targets through navigation aids and marking by Pathfinder aircraft. Accuracy was limited, so the bombing was area attacks, destroying entire city districts rather than specific factories. The USAAF insisted on daylight precision bombing, arguing that their heavily armed bombers flying in tight defensive formations could fight their way to targets and destroy them accurately with the Norden bombsight. Both approaches would converge on Germany. The RAF bombed by night, the Americans by day. German cities would have no respite. This was not 8 months of raids. This would be years of continuous bombing, escalating in intensity as Allied production delivered more aircraft and trained more crews. The first indication of what was coming arrived on the night of May 30th to 31st, 1942. If you find this story engaging,
please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Operation Millennium, the first 1,000-bomber raid, targeted Cologne. Harris had scraped together 1,047 aircraft by including training units and every serviceable bomber command possessed. The force dropped over 2,000 tons of bombs in 90 minutes. Approximately 469 civilians died, and 45,000 were made homeless. Much of the medieval city center was destroyed. Over 3,000 buildings were demolished completely, and 9,000 seriously damaged. The psychological impact in Germany was significant. Until then, German civilians had experienced only scattered raids. Goebbels' propaganda had assured them that the Luftwaffe protected the Reich, that British bombing was ineffective, that Germany's anti-aircraft defenses were impregnable. Cologne shattered those assurances. German newspapers could not hide the destruction. Too many people had relatives in Cologne. Too many soldiers on leave visited the ruined city and saw the truth. The turning point for German civilians came not in a single raid, but in the cumulative realization through 1943 that the bombing would not stop, that it would only intensify, and that nothing could prevent it. The raids that drove this understanding home occurred in Hamburg from July 24th through August 3rd, 1943, in a series of attacks the RAF called Operation Gomorrah. Hamburg was Germany's second-largest city and its most important port, with a population of approximately 1.8 million. The city had been bombed before, but what happened in late July 1943 was unprecedented. On the night of July 24th, 791 British bombers attacked. They dropped 2,300 tons of bombs, including huge numbers of incendiaries. Fires consumed entire neighborhoods. The RAF returned on July 25th in daylight with American B-17 bombers. That night, July 26th, another British raid. Then July 27th brought another American daylight attack. On the night of July 27th to 28th, 739 RAF bombers attacked again. This raid created something unprecedented in warfare, a firestorm. The conditions were specific. A hot, dry summer had left buildings and vegetation tinder dry. The bombing concentrated incendiaries in a dense urban area with narrow streets. Thousands of individual fires merged into one vast conflagration that created its own weather system. The fire consumed oxygen so rapidly that hurricane-force winds rushed toward the center, feeding the flames with fresh air. Temperatures in the fire zone exceeded 1,400 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt glass and metal. People in the firestorm zone had no chance of survival. Those who
remained in their homes, were roasted alive as buildings became ovens. Those who fled into the streets were caught by the winds and blown into the flames, or suffocated as the fire consumed the oxygen they needed to breathe. Those who jumped into canals and waterways to escape the heat often died anyway as the water itself began to boil. Approximately 42,600 civilians died in Hamburg during Operation Gomorrah, most of them in the firestorm on the night of July 27th to 28th. After the raids, Nazi officials surveyed the damage in Hamburg and understood that Germany faced catastrophe. Goebbels wrote in his diary on July 26th, "The city is undergoing frightful punishment. We are facing problems there of a sort which we have hitherto not known. We simply cannot get the fires under control." By August 3rd, after viewing reconnaissance photographs, he wrote, "The damage is colossal and indeed ghastly. It is a real catastrophe." Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and Minister of Armaments, visited Hamburg after the raids. He later wrote in his memoirs that he told Hitler a series of attacks like Hamburg on 6 major German cities would end armaments production and force Germany to surrender. Speer calculated that if the Allies could replicate Hamburg's destruction in other industrial centers, German war production would collapse within months. Hitler, according to Speer, refused to accept this assessment, but could offer no solution. The Hamburg raids demonstrated to German civilians and leadership what they were truly facing. This was not reciprocal bombing, not equivalent retaliation. This was industrial-scale destruction that Germany could not answer. The Luftwaffe had stopped bombing Britain in 1941 because it lacked the resources to continue. The British and Americans were just beginning, and their resources appeared limitless. After Hamburg, the bombing continued without pause. Through the fall and winter of 1943 and into 1944, RAF Bomber Command and the USAAF 8th Air Force attacked German cities with increasing force. Berlin, the Reich capital, became a primary target. Air Marshal Harris believed that destroying Berlin would end the war. From November 1943 through March 1944, the RAF conducted 16 major raids on the city in what became known as the Battle of Berlin. The raids were costly for both sides. Berlin was heavily defended with flak batteries and night fighters. RAF bomber losses were severe, with over 500 aircraft shot down and another 300 damaged beyond repair. But Berlin suffered enormous damage. Approximately 6,000 acres of the city were destroyed. Between 20,000 and 50,000 civilians died, though exact figures remain disputed due to incomplete records and refugees in the city. Over 1 million Berliners were made homeless. Yet Berlin did not surrender, and Germany continued fighting. Harris's belief that bombing alone could force capitulation proved incorrect, just as Duhay's theories had been incorrect when applied to Britain. Civilian populations, whether British or German, proved more resilient than pre-war theorists predicted. But the destruction continued because Allied strategic doctrine demanded it, because the resources existed to sustain the offensive, and because no other method existed to directly strike at Germany while ground forces prepared for the invasion of France. The Americans focused on daylight attacks against industrial targets, though the distinction between precision and area bombing often blurred. Weather, smoke, defensive fire, and the chaos of combat made accurate bombing difficult. Many American raids devastated residential areas adjacent to their intended targets. The cumulative effect was the destruction of German industrial capacity, alongside the destruction of German cities. Consider the scale of American production supporting this campaign. The United States built over 18,000 B-24 Liberators, the most produced American military aircraft in history. Boeing produced over 12,700 B-17 Flying Fortresses. These were complex four-engine bombers requiring tens of thousands of components, built in factories that operated around the clock. The industrial base that produced these aircraft also produced fighters, transports, trainers, engines, propellers, instruments, radios, weapons, ammunition, fuel, spare parts, and all the supporting equipment necessary for strategic bombing. By 1944, the USAF could dispatch over 1,000 heavy bombers on a single mission, and do so repeatedly, day after day. These formations were escorted by hundreds of long-range fighters, including the P-51 Mustang, which could accompany bombers all the way to targets deep in Germany and back. The Luftwaffe, fighting on multiple fronts and increasingly short of fuel and experienced pilots, could not stop these raids. German fighters inflicted losses, sometimes heavy losses, but they could not prevent the bombing. German civilians watched the bomber streams pass overhead, their vapor trails marking the sky, knowing that somewhere those bombs would fall, that entire city blocks would be obliterated, that thousands would die. The psychological impact was crushing. Unlike the British during the Blitz, who could hope the raids might end after some months, Germans in 1944 had no such hope. The bombing would continue until Germany was defeated, until the war ended, until there was nothing left to bomb. The Nazi government tried to maintain morale through propaganda. Goebbels promised miracle weapons that would turn the tide. The V-1 flying bomb and V-2 rocket were deployed against Britain starting in June 1944. But these weapons, while terrifying, could not match the destructive capacity of
Allied strategic bombing. Germany launched approximately 30,000 V weapons against Britain, killing roughly 9,000 people. By comparison, Allied bombers were killing thousands of Germans weekly by late 1944. By early 1945, Germany was being systematically destroyed from the air. The statistics from this period reveal the intensity of the campaign. In January 1945 alone, Allied bombers dropped over 95,000 tons of bombs on Germany. In February, despite shorter months and poor weather, they dropped over 82,000 tons. In March, over 132,000 tons. This was more tonnage than the Luftwaffe had dropped on Britain during the entire 8 months of the Blitz, delivered in single months. The most controversial raid of the war occurred in mid-February 1945 against Dresden. The city, located in eastern Germany, was a rail and communication center. It was also filled with refugees fleeing the advancing Soviet armies. On the night of February 13th to 14th, RAF bombers attacked in 2 waves. American bombers followed with daylight raids on February 14th and 15th. The bombing created another firestorm similar to Hamburg. Casualty figures for Dresden have been disputed for decades, with estimates ranging from 25,000 to over 100,000 dead. Modern research suggests approximately 25,000 fatalities, though the exact number will never be known. Many victims were refugees whose presence in the city was not recorded. The destruction of Dresden, coming so late in the war against a city with limited industrial importance, raised questions about the morality and military necessity of area bombing that continue to be debated. But Dresden was not unique in its devastation, only in the attention it received. Pforzheim was attacked on February 23, 1945. In 22 minutes, 379 British bombers destroyed over 80% of the city center and killed approximately 17,000 people, roughly 1/4 of the city's population. Würzburg was destroyed on March 16th with casualties exceeding 5,000. Hildesheim, Potsdam, Paderborn, Nordhausen, and dozens of other cities suffered similar raids in the final months of the war. German cities that survived into April and May 1945 faced bombing until the very last days.
The final RAF Bomber Command raid occurred on May 2nd to 3rd, 1945, against Kiel. The war in Europe ended on May 8th, 1945, with Germany's unconditional surrender. By then, virtually every major German city had been heavily bombed. Many were largely rubble. Industrial production had collapsed. Transportation networks were shattered. Millions of Germans were homeless, living in cellars, shelters, and ruins. The final accounting of the strategic bombing campaign against Germany reveals the disparity between what Germany inflicted and what Germany received. The Luftwaffe dropped approximately 41,000 tons of bombs on Britain during the 8-month Blitz. The RAF and USAAF dropped approximately 2.7 million tons of bombs on Germany and German-occupied territories during nearly 6 years of operations. The ratio was roughly 66-1. British civilian casualties from German bombing totaled approximately 60,000 killed over the entire war, with most deaths occurring during the Blitz. German civilian casualties from Allied bombing are estimated between 300,000 and 600,000 killed, with most historians accepting figures around 400,000 to 500,000. The exact number is uncertain due to incomplete records, refugees, and the chaos of the war's final months. Beyond the death toll, the material destruction in Germany was comprehensive. Approximately 3.6 million German homes were destroyed or severely damaged, roughly 20% of the nation's housing stock. Approximately 50% of urban housing in cities over 100,000 population was destroyed. Major industrial facilities were demolished or damaged beyond repair. Rail yards, bridges, canals, and roads were cratered. Germany's infrastructure was shattered. The psychological impact on German civilians who survived cannot be quantified, but was profound. For years, they had lived under nightly terror. Sirens would wail, sending people rushing to shelters, basements, bunkers. They would huddle in darkness as bombs fell, as buildings collapsed, as fires raged. They would emerge to find neighborhoods gone, friends and family dead, possessions lost. Then they would endure it again the next night, and the next, and the next. The profound irony of the strategic bombing war reveals itself in the comparison between theory and reality, between what was intended and what actually occurred. Germany pioneered the application of strategic bombing in World War II, attacking Warsaw, Rotterdam, London, and other cities with the belief that bombing could break civilian morale and force capitulation. The theory failed when applied to Britain. 8 months of sustained bombing did not break British will or significantly impair British war production. Britain continued fighting, and German strategic bombing capability was exhausted. When Britain and America answered with their own strategic bombing campaign, they brought industrial resources Germany could not match. The same theory that failed to defeat Britain also failed to defeat Germany. German civilians endured years of bombing without their government surrendering. German industry, despite massive destruction, continued producing weapons until the final weeks of the war, albeit at reduced levels. Strategic bombing alone did not win the war. Ground armies had to invade and conquer Germany. But the difference in scale was what mattered psychologically and materially. Germany bombed Britain for 8 months with limited resources and achieved limited results. Britain and America bombed Germany for 5 years with vast resources and achieved comprehensive destruction. The contrast revealed a fundamental truth about industrial warfare between modern nations. Production capacity determines outcomes. The nation that can build more weapons, train more personnel, and sustain operations longer will prevail regardless of doctrine, courage, or tactical skill. German civilians in Berlin or Hamburg or Dresden who survived the war understood this truth intimately. They had lived through what their own military had started but could not sustain. They had experienced the answer to the Blitz, an answer delivered over years rather than months. with resources Germany could never have matched. The bomber crews who attacked London in 1941 believed they were demonstrating Germany's mastery of modern warfare. They could not foresee that within 4 years their own cities would be burning under bombs delivered by fleets of aircraft that made the Luftwaffe's bomber force look modest. The mathematics were simple and unforgiving. Germany dropped 41,000 tons of bombs on Britain. Britain and America dropped 2.7 million tons on Germany. Germany killed 60,000 British civilians. The Allies killed perhaps 500,000 German civilians. Germany exhausted its bombing capacity in 8 months. The Allies sustained bombing for 5 years. Every metric revealed the same pattern. Germany had initiated a form of warfare it could not sustain against opponents with superior resources. On the morning after December 29, 1940, when German reconnaissance aircraft photographed the burning city of London, German commanders saw confirmation of their theories. Strategic bombing worked. Britain would be forced to negotiate. They were wrong, but their error would take years to become undeniably apparent. The fires that consumed London that night were answered by fires that consumed German cities night after night, year after year, until Germany lay in ruins. The lesson, if there was one, concerned the nature of modern industrial warfare. Once begun, such conflicts become tests of productive capacity, resource availability, and societal resilience. The nation that pioneers a destructive tactic may discover that opponents can apply that same tactic with greater resources and intensity. Germany demonstrated strategic bombing. Britain and America perfected it, bringing industrial-scale destruction that Germany's military theorists had never imagined possible. The architects of aerial terror discovered what it meant to live under bombs without respite, to watch their cities burn, to know that nothing they could do would make it stop. They had started something they could not finish, and the answer came in flames that burned for 5 years. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.